Hello everybody, my name is Iain Hamlin and I've been surveying solitary bees and wasps in Ayrshire for the past 16 years. In this presentation I'm going to provide an introduction to the solitary bees that you find in the Ayrshire counties. I'm going to start off by giving some basic information about solitary bees. Then I'm going to run through each one of the solitary bee families that you find in Ayrshire. Then I'm going to talk through about a dozen commonly encountered species of solitary bee. And finally, I'm going to talk a bit about how to find solitary bees when you're out and about in the countryside. 67 species of solitary bee have been recorded in Ayrshire so far, and that number will undoubtedly go up as we discover new species and as new species colonise from the south, moving up because of climate change. It's important to point out that some solitary bee species are not actually solitary. So we tend to think of solitary bees as species that provision their nests individually, but in reality some species, particularly amongst the Halictus and Lasioglossums, are eusocial. So for example, in the common Halictus rubicundus, you often have one female that acts as a queen and then several other females in the same nest that act as workers. But generally speaking, most solitary bees do create and provision their own nests individually. Solitary bees most commonly nest in the ground, digging their burrows particularly in light sandy soils. However, many species nest in cavities, for example holes in wood or holes in walls, and several species such as Hylaeus bees nest in the stems of plants such as bramble. Solitary bees are generally non-aggressive and they very rarely sting, and they're quite shy too. It's not too difficult to get close to a bumblebee or to a honeybee, but solitary bees are often much more timid and will fly away more readily when disturbed. I'm going to run through each of the families of solitary bee that you find in Ayrshire, starting with Andrinas and then working my way through alphabetically all the way to Sphecodes. Andrina is the largest family of solitary bee in Ayrshire. There are 20 species so far recorded in the county. They're also called mining bees because they dig nest burrows in the ground. It's generally easy to recognise a bee as an Andrina because they're quite distinctive in that they're hairy, medium-sized to large bees with pollen collecting apparatus on their legs. They essentially look like stereotypical bees, and most people who find them on a flower or in their net would recognise them instantly as being a solitary bee. This one here is Andrina clarkella. It's the earliest Andrina to emerge. You find it in March, foraging on willow usually, and you can see this one here looks as if it's collected a pollen load from a willow tree, and this is it coming back to its nest burrow. This is another typical Andrina. This is Andrina laponica, which was photographed at a raised bog where it forages mainly on blaeberry. Not all Andrinas are very big and very hairy. Some are quite small, relatively hairless. For example, this Andrina coetana is sat on a bramble petal, which shows just how small it is. These small Andrinas could be mistaken by some for Lasioglossum bees, which are a family of relatively small, black hairless bees that I'll touch on later in this presentation. There are two species of Anthophora in Ayrshire. One species, Anthophora plumipes, has only been officially recorded once, and that was by a visiting entomologist on the Ardeer Peninsula. However, Anthophora plumipes is a species that seems to be spreading up the east coast, and so within the next few years one might expect it to become more widespread in Ayrshire as well. The most common species in Ayrshire is Anthophora furcata, and this is how you generally find it, hovering around hedge woundwort or marsh woundwort. It does look very much like a bumblebee. In particular, it looks like common carder bee, Bombus pascorum. However, there are some differences. So for example, when Anthophora furcata is buzzing around, it tends to buzz with a higher pitched whine, and it tends to be more precise in its hovering, almost like a hummingbird, as compared to bumblebees, which are a bit clumsier when they're flying around from flower to flower. The males can easily be told apart from bumblebees by the colour of their faces. So as you can see here, this male has a yellow face, not just yellow facial hairs, but the actual body of its face itself is yellow, and that's not something that you find in bumblebees. Coleoxys bees are cuckoo bees, cuckoos of leafcutters, and there's only one species that's been formally recorded in Ayrshire, and that's Coleoxys elongata. There is, however, a mention from about 100 years ago in an old journal article of Coleoxys inermis being recorded down at Culzean. So it's possible that there is more than one species of Coleoxys in Ayrshire. This is a female, Coleoxys elongata, and you can see its sharp pointed tail that gives the family its common name of sharp-tailed bees. And this species is largely restricted to the coast in Ayrshire. Certainly all Ayrshire records come from the coast, and the reason it's largely confined to the coast is because that's where there's a critical mass of leafcutter bees, which act as hosts for this species. On the Ayrshire coast, it attacks the nests of Megachile willibiella, Megachile circumcincta, and I've also found it attacking the nests of Megachile versicolor as well in a bee hotel. This is a male Coleoxys elongata, and it's a bee that, if it turns up in your net, could easily confuse you. It looks a bit like a leafcutter bee, a bit like an osmia, a bit like an andrena. However, two things in particular should alert you to the fact that it's a Coleoxys. The first is that it's got 4 sharp teeth at the end of the abdomen, and also you can see in the photograph that the thorax is very, very roughly punctured as well. And these two things should suggest to you that you might have a Coleoxys in your net. There are 4 species of Coletes in Ayrshire, and each species looks very similar. They've got brown, very hairy thoraxes and heads, and they've got black and white striped abdomens. So they can be very difficult to tell apart in the field. So, if you want to have a guess as to which species of Coletes you found, then it is a really good idea to pay attention to the species of flower that you found it foraging on. This is a Coletes floralis, and it's a species of sand dunes in Ayrshire, and it has a strong preference for umbellifers. You can also find it on things like sheepspit and wild thyme, and I've even found it foraging on Rose rugosa. However, it has a very, very strong preference for umbellifers such as hogweed, angelica, hemlock water dropwort, and giant hogweed. It loves giant hogweed. So if you find on the Ayrshire coast in dunes a Coletes bee on an umbellifer, then there's a very good chance it's going to be Coletes floralis. If you find a Coletes in midsummer in dunes foraging on ragwort, then there's a good chance that it's going to be Coletes fodiens. If you find a Coletes in July or August foraging on heather, then it's probably going to be Coletes succinctus. And if you find a Coletes foraging on sea mayweed or tansy or oxeye daisy, then it's probably going to be Coletes davisanus. So it's really important when you're trying to guess what type of Coletes you've found to pay attention to the species of flower that it's foraging on. There is just one species of Epiolus bee in Ayrshire, and that's Epiolus cruciger. On the coast, in dunes, it kleptoparasitises the rare Caletes bee, Caletes floralis. And this is how you tend to see Epiolus bees in Ayrshire. They'll be hovering around in sand dunes in front of vertical sand cliffs, looking for the nests of Caletes floralis. There are two species of Halictus in Ayrshire. One species, the rarest, is Halictus tumulurum. It's a very small, bald, metallic bee that looks very like a Lasioglossum, and it's been found at a few sites scattered in Ayrshire. However, much more common is Halictus rubicundus. This is a female, Halictus rubicundus, and it looks reasonably distinctive in the field. It looks a bit like a Caletes bee superficially, but when you get a fresh specimen, the hairs are much more orange, and also the actual surface of the hind legs themselves are orangey golden in colour as compared to a Caletes bee. This is a very common species, a very, very common and widespread species, including in urban areas. It's not uncommon to find it in gardens and in brownfield sites. And there are nesting aggregations, for example, at Fairley train station, in the flower beds, also at Ardrossan South Beach station, and in Montgomery Street outside Irvine train station. So this is a very urban bee that you're very likely to encounter. There are three species of Hylaeus bee in Ayrshire, and they're all quite rare. The most common species of Hylaeus is Hylaeus hylenatus. It's been found at many sites along the coast, and also found at a few sites a little bit further inland. As to how far it stretches inland, that's not entirely clear, but it's almost certainly the most common and widespread species. Hylaeus brevicornis does seem pretty much restricted to coastal sites in Ayrshire, and Hylaeus confusus has been recorded so infrequently it's not quite clear as to what its distribution is, but the chances are it's found inland as well as on the coast. They are pretty interesting looking bees. They've got very pale yellow facial features, and this is a male here on an oxeye daisy, and you can see how small it is. You know, very distinctive looking bees, but very, very small. So small that there's a very good chance you'd mistake them for being a fly and not realise that you found a really interesting species of solitary bee. Hylaeus hylenatus nests in various different types of place. It nests in the ground sometimes, it nests in hollow stems, such as bramble stems. It nests in old walls. I've seen it do that on the Ayrshire Peninsula. So it is a candidate species, very unlikely, but it is a potential candidate bee species that might turn up in a bee hotel in a garden. Lasioglossum is a big family of solitary bees, relatively speaking. There are 11 species in Ayrshire, and there are probably more than that. So 11 species have been recorded, but there are probably at least one or two additional species yet to be found. And they're a tricky family to identify because they all look very, very similar. They are all small and black and rather nondescript. So they're very much microscope jobs when it comes to being sure what species you've found. Perhaps the best way to find Lasioglossums is to investigate the flower heads of yellow composites. Things like hawkbits and hawkweeds are very popular amongst Lasioglossums. And if you're wandering around looking at yellow composite flower heads, look for an insect that's curled up like a comma. So when beetles and flies nectar on these flowers, they're usually rather straight-bodied, whereas Lasioglossums have this very characteristic habit of curling up as they forage on flower heads. There are 5 species of Megachile bee in the county, and these are the famous leafcutter bees. Some are quite common. For example, pictured here is a female Megachile willoughbyella, and it's a widespread and common species that you find in gardens. Similarly, Megachile centuncularis is another common species that often turns up in gardens. Megachile versicolor seems to be locally common on the coast, and there are 2 rare species, Megachile circumcincta and Megachile maritima, which are both restricted to sand dunes. This is a female Megachile circumcincta, the black-headed leafcutter bee, and it's a rare sand dune species, photographed, as you can tell, in sand dunes, carrying a leaf back to its nest. They can be a tricky family to identify in terms of telling between the species. One way to identify what species a female belongs to is to look at the colour of the hairs under its abdomen, its scopal hairs. For example, this is Megachile versicolor, and in this species it's got very bold orange hairs under its abdomen, but these hairs don't reach all the way back to the end of the abdomen. The orange hairs are replaced by thick black hairs when you get towards the end of the abdomen, whereas in a similar species, Megachile centuncularis, it's got orange hairs all the way to the back of the abdomen. Some of the males can be separated by looking at their front feet. So the males of Megachile centuncularis and versicolor have pretty normal front feet, whereas the males of willoughbyella, maritima and circumcincta have these kind of expanded white front feet, which are very, very hairy. And the nature, the shape of those expansions and the length of those hairs can tell between those 3 species. Megachiles are cavity nesters, and they take very, very readily to bee hotels. This is a bee hotel on the Ayrshire coast, and it's got Megachile versicolor nesting in it. But in gardens, you're more likely to get Megachile willoughbyella and Megachile centuncularis nesting in bee hotels. And you can tell if your bee hotel has been occupied by a leafcutter bee because it blocks the entrances to the nest holes with green leaves. There are 11 species of nomada in Ayrshire. And nomadas are usually very bright, big, boldly coloured bees that could easily be mistaken for wasps. In fact, there are a couple of black and yellow species in Ayrshire, and those in particular could be mistaken for ectemnius wasps. Some species can be told apart by photographs. Sometimes as well, it's a good idea to look at what species it's attacking the nests of if you want to get an idea of what species you found. So for example, the previous species was Nomada flava, and it was flying around in the company of lots of Andrena scotica, which is its host species. So if you find a nomada that looks a bit like Nomada flava, and it's in the company of lots of Andrena scotica, then you could make a provisional guess that you found Nomada flava. The species pictured here is Nomada leucophthalma, and it's a kleptoparasite of Andrena clarkella, an early spring bee. So if you are in March looking at the nests of Andrena clarkella and you find a big nomada flying around, then there's a very good chance it's Nomada leucophthalma. There are just 2 species of Osmia recorded from Ayrshire. One is Osmia bicornis, the red mason bee, and that's pictured here, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. The other species of Osmia in the county is the blue mason bee, which is Osmia caerulescens. And this is a much rarer bee in the county. In England, you find it commonly in gardens, but in Ayrshire, it does seem much more local, not a common garden species. I tend to find it out in the pine woods of the Ayrshire Peninsula, where it nests in the holes left by longhorn beetles. This is a male, which has a green tint to it. And this is a female, which has a blue tint to it, although in this photograph you can't really easily see the blue tint. Like I say, I tend to find this species nesting in old beetle holes in dead trees, but they nest in other cavities too. In fact, down in England, blue mason bees are a common species to find in insect hotels. And here's a photograph here of, well, the world's ugliest bee hotel, which has been colonised by mason bees. And you can tell when your bee hotel has been colonised by mason bees because the ends get plugged up with little plugs of clay soil. There are at least 5 species of Sphecodes in Ayrshire. 5 have been officially recorded, and they are charming bees. I've always liked Sphecodes bees. They have this beautiful black and red bicoloured appearance, and I intuitively like them, but they remain hard to like when you try and identify them because they all look the same. They're all black and red. So I'm going to run through all the different species of Sphecodes over the next few slides, in part because I like them so much, and also because I just want to illustrate how similar each species looks. This is Sphecodes gibbous, and it's quite uncommon in Ayrshire, despite the fact that it attacks the nests of Halictus rubicundus, which is a very common and widespread bee. One way to identify Sphecodes, or at least to provisionally identify Sphecodes gibbous, is its wings. Its wings are very darkly clouded, which sets it apart from the other Sphecodes in the county. This is Sphecodes pellucidus, and one of the best ways to provisionally identify, to have a guess at its identity, is the location where it's found. So if you find a bee in sand dunes, flying around areas of open sand and crawling around the ground in open sandy areas, then there's a reasonably good chance that it's Sphecodes pellucidus. It's a very common species in Ayrshire sand dunes, particularly in areas of very loose soil, loose sand, which is where its host Andrena barbilabris nests. This is the most common and widespread species of Sphecodes. It's Sphecodes jephyrelis, and it's perhaps best provisionally identified by its size. It's a tiny little Sphecodes. It varies a bit in size. You get some that are a bit bigger, you get some that are a bit smaller, but if you find a truly tiny Sphecodes, then there's a very good chance it's going to be Sphecodes jephyrelis. Another widespread but less common Sphecodes is Sphecodes monilicornis, and it's a species that you can find randomly sometimes, just turning up in a bit of bare ground looking for Lasioglossum nests to parasitize. And I've also found it a few times at the nesting aggregations of Halictus rubicundus, which is another species that it goes after. Now, one way to provisionally identify this species, now underline the word provisionally, tentatively identify, is looking at its head. If you get a good photograph, you can see that the shape of its head is pretty square. It's got quite a big, thick, square, bull-headed appearance, and that's not always caught in photographs, but if you see that feature, then there's a reasonable chance that you've maybe found Sphecodes monilicornis. The final species is Sphecodes hyalinatus, and it is maybe the most nondescript species in that it's kind of medium sized. It can be a little bit smaller sometimes, a little bit bigger, and you find it in a variety of places. It's quite difficult to tentatively identify unless you get it under a microscope. It does, though, have a preference for higher ground, more upland habitats where its main host species, Lasioglossum fritellum, is found. So if you are on higher ground, and if one of the most common Lasioglossums around you is Lasioglossum fritellum, then there's a reasonable chance, that the Sphecodes that you've found is Sphecodes hyalinatus. I'm going to talk now about some of the most commonly encountered species of solitary bee in Ayrshire. Andrina barbilabris is quite a common bee down by the coast. It nests in areas of loose sand, and you can sometimes find it on brownfield sites, but particularly sandy sites near the coast. It has a great fondness for those. The males are perhaps easier to find than the females. In April, when you have areas of open, loose, bare sand, you can often find lots of males flying about. They're paler than the females, and you can see the male here is the one to the left. They're paler than females, slimmer, and it's not uncommon to find quite a lot flying around areas of bare sand in spring looking for females. Andrina bicolor is a common and widespread species in spring. It appears as early as March, and it has a very strong preference for dandelions and for willow as well. There is a second generation that appears in late summer, and I tend to find those are strongly associated with harebells when down at the coast. This second generation is much less numerous though, so a common spring bee, but the second generation much less abundant in late summer. Andrina denticulata is a species worth drawing your attention to. It's a late summer species that has a very strong association with ragwort. So if you are somewhere sandy, particularly if you're near the coast, and you are looking at ragwort in July or August, and you see a bee on it and Andrina foraging, there's a good chance it's Andrina denticulata. It's quite a distinctive bee. It's got complete hair bands on the abdomen, which is not a particularly common thing amongst the Scottish Andrinas, and these hair bands are quite shaggy as well, and its thorax looks slightly bald, and in part that effect has been created by the fact that the hairs in the central part of the thorax are black. So it's a reasonably distinctive bee, and certainly if you're on the coast in sandy areas in late summer, it's definitely one worth looking out for on ragwort. Andrina haemaroa is a common and widespread bee of spring and early summer, and it's very distinctive when you get a fresh specimen. The thorax hairs are very, very foxy, almost kind of bloody coloured, as is the tip of the abdomen. So a very distinctive bee when you get it fresh, but beware, it can lose its hairs as the weeks go by, and also it can become much more faded as well and become a less distinctive bee. Andrina scotica is another common and widespread solitary bee. It's reasonably distinctive in that it's very large and very robust, and there aren't many bees, certainly not many Andrinas, that are quite so big and robust as this one. It could be mistaken perhaps for Andrina clarkella, but that species tends to have very dark hairs, black hairs on its abdomen. Andrina subopica is worth mentioning. It's a reasonably widespread and locally abundant Andrina. It has a preference for open woodland and scrubby habitats. It's particularly fond of things like bramble and hawthorn. And if you are encountering what you think are Lasioglossums, it's worth checking that one of the lasioglossums isn't actually a small andrena like Andrena subobica. Now, compared to some of the bigger lasioglossums, it has several distinctive features. For example, you can see along its inner eyes it's got some felt-like hair, which is something you really don't find, not very obviously, on lasioglossums. Lasioglossums, the big ones that you could confuse with small andrenas, tend to have complete hair bands. This is an example of a large lasioglossum with complete hair bands, whereas Andrena subobica only has partial hair bands at the sides of the abdomen. Colites davisanus is the most common and widespread of the colites in Ayrshire. It has a fondness for urban places, as well as the wider countryside, places like brownfield sites, to a very small extent gardens, and dunes are places that it's particularly fond of. So in gardens and brownfield sites, it has a particular fondness for oxeye daisy and tansy, and also Canadian goldenrod. Out in dunes, it loves sea mayweed. And here's a photograph of Colites davisanus doing what it does very often, which is sitting on the flower head of an oxeye daisy. I've mentioned Halictus rubicundus before in this presentation. It's a very common and widespread bee, and if you find a stripy bee in your net, or if you pot a stripy bee, then it's certainly worth considering that you've found Halictus rubicundus. Lasioglossum albipes and Lasioglossum calceatum are a species pair that are very, very difficult to separate in the field. They're both large lasioglossums, and they've got white stripes, white hair bands on the abdomen, and there's a great oranginess about those bands. Not the hairs themselves, but the actual body of the creature has a distinct orange tint to it round about the hair bands. They are common bees. They are found in gardens, they are found in dunes and waste places, and just about everywhere with suitable nesting habitats and some kind of forage resource. Interestingly, the males of these species are the only lasioglossums that we get in Scotland that have red abdomens. So the males could be mistaken for Sphecodes bees. Lasioglossum cupromicans is another common urban species. It nests in gardens, it nests in old walls, and it's perhaps the most common of the metallic lasioglossums. It's a very small thing, but if you notice it, if you recognise it's not just a fly, it's actually a small bee, and you identify that it's metallic, then there's a good chance that what you found is cupromicans. Although Lasioglossum leucopus is another reasonably common species of metallic lasioglossum in Ayrshire. Megachile centuncularis is one of two common and widespread leafcutter bees in the county. It's not uncommon to find it in gardens. The female is reasonably distinctive if you get a good look at her. Under the abdomen, her pollen collecting hairs are bright orange all the way to the tip of the abdomen, and this contrasts with other species which have a mixture of different colours in different parts of the hairs under the abdomen. It can be reasonably common in gardens sometimes, and it's a reasonably common resident of bee hotels as well. Megachile willoughbyella is another species that you can encounter in gardens. Perhaps the place I find it most of all is round about harebells in sand dunes. I've found it on harebells inland as well, but if it's midsummer and you're in sand dunes and there's lots of harebells, it's worth taking a close look at them, as there's every chance that there's going to be one or more Megachile willoughbyella foraging between them. There are 3 Megachiles in the county which have large white furry front feet. 2 of them are very rare and species that are restricted to dunes. So if you're away from dunes in Ayrshire and you find a Megachile male with big white hairy front feet, then it's probably going to be Megachile willoughbyella. I've put Nomada marshmallow on this list of commonly encountered species, and it is reasonably common. Sometimes it pops up in gardens because its host species, Andrina scotica, is a garden species too. And it's one of 2 species of Nomada in Ayrshire that have black and yellow markings on the abdomen. The other species is Nomada rufipes, which has a couple of colour forms, one of which has black and yellow, the other has black, yellow and red. But the thing about Nomada rufipes is it's a late summer species. It tends to fly from July onwards, whereas Nomada marshmallow tends to have its flight season over and done with by the end of June. So if it's spring or early summer and you see a black and yellow Nomada, the chances are it's going to be Nomada marshmallow. Osmia bicornis is quite a common bee in urban areas. It's a hole nester, a very common resident of bee hotels, and when you get your eye on, you end up seeing them just about everywhere in very built up town centres, etc. You even find them there, and they're quite distinctive when they're fresh because they do have a distinct red tint to their hair, hence the name red mason bee. But they are a species that fades quite quickly. So by the end of the season, you find lots and lots of very pale-haired red mason bees. I'm going to give some tips now about what to do when you're out and about looking for solitary bees, how to find them, and what kind of habitat features to be mindful of and attracted to when you're hunting for bees. This video illustrates one of the best ways to find bees. It's to take your net and sweep through the vegetation. Sweep over the top of the vegetation with the rim of your net, going through the flower heads, not so fast and so firm that you're decapitating the flowers, but do make contact with the flower heads so that anything on the flower heads will be swept up into your net. And doing this often produces many, many more bees than you would find just by wandering about and looking at flower heads or looking at potential nesting sites. However, as well as sweeping through the vegetation, it is a good idea to go out and try and identify any sites that might be potential nesting sites for bees, and to scan the flower heads of potential foraging resources of bees, and potting and netting anything you find at these places. If I'm out at a site and I'm working it for bees, then one of the things I do is I look for potential nesting sites, and I go over and I stake them out and I sweep my net in the vicinity and see what I pick up. Many species of bee nest in the ground, so they're fond of nesting in various features like in the photograph here. You can see in a disused quarry there's an embankment with lots of bare ground, and the material is reasonably friable enough that you're able to dig into it if you're a solitary bee. So seeking out features like this is always a good idea. Here's another example. This is a bit of trackside erosion caused by cattle just outside West Kilbride, and you can see as well the soil here is quite light, and combined with the erosion you've got a really nice feature that various species of solitary bee were nesting in. Another important type of erosion that provides great habitat for nesting bees is footpaths. So this is an example. At Ayrshire Quarry, there's a footpath which has worn away the vegetation and left some south-facing compacted ground, and this provides nesting habitat for several species of bee and wasp. Sand dunes, of course, are great for nesting bees. They've got lots and lots of sand everywhere, lots and lots of bare sand for bees to burrow in. But not all sand is created equal, and generally speaking, there are certain bits of dunes where you get the most bees. Loose sand is often undesirable. There are some species, like Andrena barbalabris, that likes loose sand, but most bees prefer sand that's held together a bit better by vegetation. So if you look at the turf, where it meets the exposed sand, just underneath the turf, at the very top of the sand cliffs, is where the sand is being held together by the roots of the grass, and that's where you're most likely to find most bees making their nests. Sand quarries can be good for nesting bees and wasps as well. In fact, sometimes they can be really good. And along the Ayrshire coast, you've got several golf courses that have their own small sand quarries, and those sand quarries are often the best place on golf courses to find solitary bees. This is an example from Bogside. This was an informal sand quarry created by the golf course out there to provide sand for its bunkers, and it's a fantastic site for bees and wasps. So many species, including many rare species, inhabit those sand cliffs. As well as checking potential nesting features for solitary bees, when you're out and about, you should also check flowers for foraging bees. Some flowers are better than others, and one type of flower that is particularly appealing to bees is yellow composites. And if you're sweeping through a mass of yellow composites like this with your net, then there's a very good chance that you're going to pick up at least one or two Lasioglossum bees. So if you're at a site and you're looking for solitary bees, for example, this is a former school grounds that have become overgrown with wildflowers, then a great feature to look for is patches of yellow composite. It's really, really common to find Lasioglossums nectaring amongst those flowers. Another great flower for nectaring bees is bird's-foot trefoil, and in dunes and at abandoned industrial sites you often find large carpets of bird's-foot trefoil, as you can see here, and sweeping through them is good for many different species of bee, particularly leafcutter bees. Leafcutter bees have a great fondness for bird's-foot trefoil. Other flowers particularly important for bees are umbellifers such as giant hogweed, hemlock water dropwort, angelica and wild carrot. Something else that it's worth checking when you're out and about looking for bees is fallen trees. So if you're in a woodland setting and there's a sunny woodland ride or sunny woodland glade and a tree has fallen over, then what you often find is male andrenas patrolling along the trunks of fallen trees. So if you're in a woodland setting, it's a good idea to try and find the trunk of a fallen tree and stake it out for male andrenas. There are various resources out there that can help you identify bees. Perhaps the most popular book is Stephen Falk and Richard Lewington's Field Guide to the Bees of Great Britain and Ireland. It's really a set of keys, a set of dichotomous identification keys, but it is lavishly illustrated, and a lot of the photos can help point you in the right direction and help you make some tentative guesses as to what the bee is that you've found. Much more expensive is George Else and Mike Edwards' The Bees of the British Isles. It's £130 for this big 2-volume hardback set, but they are beautiful books full of comprehensive information. In terms of apps, apps like Seek can perhaps help you get some indication as to the family of the bee that you found, and in some cases, some rare cases, maybe even they can make a suggestion as to the species you found. But I think apps would be of limited use when it comes to identifying many species of bee, not least because there are so many species that look very, very similar unless you put them under the microscope. Stephen Falk also has fantastic Flickr pages where for every species of bee you find lots of different photographs of the males and the females and the habitats in which you find them. So it's a good idea to Google Stephen Falk Flickr bees, and you can get some fantastic resources for bee identification. That's the end of this presentation. Thanks very much for listening. If you have any physical solitary bee or wasp specimens that you'd like identified, then do feel free to drop me an email at the address below.